My name is Mildly Gothic. Welcome to my channel. This is Domino. What I like to do here is a variety of artsy content from painting, drawing, sculpting, special effects makeups, that sort of a thing. Basically artsy, and a lot of times it'll have a dark or, as of this week, nerdy kind of a twist to it, or theme. Do you not approve of the nerdy theme? Do you not? It's hard to see. I am wearing a Star Trek shirt. The dog, I know, is probably in the way. But so what I wanted to do this week is do a painting. And this is actually inspired, so last week they did, for like Labor Day weekend, they were showing the original Star Trek, the original series Star Trek movie, Wrath of Khan. And I love this movie. It's one of my favorite Star Trek movies since I was a kid. It's just really good. It holds up incredibly well, especially in comparison with the motion picture, which is one that fans love to hate. But I love the Wrath of Khan, and there's a whole end battle in the Mutara Nebula. And it's between, I'm sorry, spoilers for a however old movie, so sure. In the Mutara Nebula, between Kirk piloting the Starship Enterprise and Khan piloting the Starship Reliant. And the nebula is important because it clouds the sensors, they can't detect each other, the shields aren't working, and so it adds a lot of suspense. And with that, the movie, I guess, directors did a really good job with the depiction of the nebula and the ships in the space crossing over one another, not entirely sure where the other one is. And so there's a lot of really, really cool sequences that came out of that. And one of those is what I'm going to be painting today. I will put it on screen wherever I have the space. And I just was watching this movie in theaters and fell in love with this scene, and I was like, I need to paint that. I have a history of painting space. I love painting space. I'll throw some of my space-themed and mostly Star Trek-themed paintings up on screen. Space is really cool. There's a lot of different ways you can approach it. There's a lot of good ways to approach it and bad ways to approach it. And the weird thing is you need to start with your light. For one of my favorites, I don't remember which nebula it is, but it's this one, Helpful Editing Me. I started with the very white and then started building up the yellows and the oranges, and then went to the blues and then the black, and then you do some blending and stuff between the two to get kind of those layers. So it's a lot of building, layering. The Mutara Nebula is a little bit different because it's very stark swaths of spirals of color, so I'm not entirely sure how I'm going to interpret that just yet, but that's kind of the general goal or plan for today, is we're gonna do a Star Trek space painting. But I'll talk more about my process as far as when it comes to space, when I get to the actual painting. Fingers crossed and my phone doesn't become collateral damage when it comes to making stars. I don't know if I'll need stars. Lord knows though that my laptop is covered in tiny speckles of white sparkly and silver and just white paint from past star attempts. So I am no stranger to space or stars or painting. I plan to use acrylic for this just because I think it'll help me get a better saturation and really the intensity that I want in comparison to watercolor. It's also the main paint that I have, so that's also part of what's influencing my decision. But with all of that, I'm a huge nerd. I love Star Trek. I love all of the Star Trek, everything. Including most of the new stuff, although it's like with an asterisk because it requires me to suspend a little bit of extra suspension of disbelief based on, just the history of the franchise. So if there's one thing I can ramble at length about, it is Star Trek. It's one of the many things. So if anyone's ever interested in not artistic and just Star Trek rambly content, I can do that. Not my plan. But if anybody out there wants to hear my opinions on Star Trek, maybe. But I know there's also plenty of actual Star Trek YouTubers who go super in-depth and get really technical with things. So, you want that opinion? I'm sure there's already better ones out there. But, for my take on it, Without further ado, let's get to an artistic rendering of the Battle of the Mutara Nebula.
So first things first, I always start with kind of drawing out what I'm going to do. And I didn't include it, but there actually was something on this canvas originally. There was a skull and then the attempt of a start of a book and like a background. But I wanted this to be a larger painting to kind of test myself. I'm used to working with very small canvases. And so I really wanted to test myself and try to make this something larger. I'm actually quite surprised how little you can see of the skull and the pencil. Granted, you can't see the pencil much at all. But yeah, it actually ended up disappearing completely by the end. And I think I talked a little bit in the watercolor video how careful you do need to be with pencil on canvas. Being light with it, making sure that it's purposeful, and if you need to erase it, being very, very careful so you don't dent the canvas so you achieve the best look. I wanted to spend a good little bit of time outlining where the ships were going to be, so that way I could coordinate and control the colors and what I was going to do. I also started by organizing some paint palettes with white, black, a very light blue, an ultramarine blue, a teal blue that I don't remember the name of off the top of my head, a pink, more like a magenta, a dark purple, a light purple, and I think I already said a light blue. Anyways, basically a variety of colors and what I needed. I was going to start with the focal point of what I believe this image is, which is the very light part in the center, and I was going to build my color out from there. I always think it's easier to add color than subtract color. So starting with the lightest allows me to add basically as much color as I want, and I don't really ever have to worry about subtracting it. This is a lot of back and forth of building up colors. You can finally start seeing some color developing, and that's because I'm going into some slightly darker colors. It takes a little bit for the colors to fully form, but in a way that I think that's really interesting, for this painting at least specifically. Typically when I approach space, I do start with the lightest point. And often for nebulas, I then go to the yellows and browns, as those are the most prominent details, and I eventually transition into the more accent colors, which tend to be blues or purples. This one, all of the colors are either primary and or accent. Like, there's no real delineation between the two, and so I was kind of bouncing back and forth and filling in areas as I saw them, kind of working with one color at a time and just putting it in the general area where I knew that color would be needed. And you'll see later how I build up and account for all of, the blending that's necessary. And that was my biggest issue with this, is the original picture definitely has a sense of depth. You can tell that the Enterprise is above the Reliant, but yet they are between layers of the nebula. And so I wanted to make sure that that was something that I captured. And the first step in order to do that is actually just capture the depth of the nebula itself, which initially I was struggling with. I was struggling to get a color saturation that I wanted, but also maintaining the light cloudiness of the nebula. And my problem was I was blending everything together. I wasn't making any strong delineations between the like the circles of the nebula. And I start with those strong delineations, but somewhere along the line I got the idea that I really should just blend this all out. And then I realized that was a bad idea, and I started actually recombining them together because that made more sense. I've been told I paint with acrylics kind of like watercolor, and maybe I do. I'll tend to put a very defined area of just like maybe the dry paint down, and then I go over that with some water added to the brush, and it really helps smooth and define it, but you keep the majority of your saturation of pigment where you initially deposited the color. This is something you kind of use for makeups as well. Wherever you initially put the brush with the color is where your highest concentration of pigment will be. So I guess maybe that's true for most art forms. But that's the way I use these kind of paints for a lot of it, until I get to the very end with the Enterprise, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But other than that, I kept my same base set of colors. Again, dark purple, light purple, a magenta, and then like 3 different blues, black and white. I never ended up mixing anything with the black, but I mixed all of those blues and purples together in a variety of ways to try to get all of the in-between colors, which ended up satisfying a lot of the problems that I was having in getting things to blend. Luckily, this one being pretty much 3 distinct shades, pink, purple, and blue, it's pretty easy. I definitely took a lot of artistic license and liberty in my accent and accentuation of the colors because I thought, why not? This thing is already a bright, colorful nebula. Why not make it even more bright and colorful? A lot of this, I'm going to be honest, is kind of me rambling about colors because it's genuinely just a back and forth process of once I got my base colors of the spirals down, I'm trying to add those colors to blend. And then I'm trying to define those edges of depth. And then I'm trying to redefine the areas of saturation and make sure that I'm getting the focal point that I want. If you'll notice, at this point in time, it's kind of a mess. It's not even kind of a mess. It just doesn't look right. The edges, you can still see very defined brush strokes. The edges are kind of messy. Things just aren't blended well. And that's because I was just straight up trying to blend everything together. And that doesn't work. Especially not when you're trying to create a sense of depth. The sense of depth is created by a foreground, a midground, and a background. And that foreground, midground, and background in this, the foreground is my Enterprise, the midground is the Reliant, and the background is my Nebula. And so I needed the Nebula to have its source of light, and the Reliant to be in the middle of that, and then the Enterprise to be on top of all of that. I left the ships blank. I could have blocked them out with white before going on top of it, but I decided to just avoid painting the ships and then try to clean up and account for my edges. Was this the best course of action? Maybe, maybe not. In reality, I did it because it helps me remember where the ship is gonna be. I don't like drawing with pencil or trying to figure out the dimensions of what I'm doing on top of pre-existing paint. I would rather just adjust the edges of my paint to account for the unrealized dimensions that I forgot to include in my base pencil drawing. And you'll see me do that with the mid-engineering section of the Enterprise. My father's gonna kill me for not remembering what the name of that is. But the section of the Enterprise that the nacelles connect to, I absolutely drew the proportions wrong in my initial image, and I fixed it by just extending the paint. And of course for these, I started with a base coat of a gray. I went very dark for the Enterprise, as could be seen in the initial image, and I went a lot lighter for the Reliant. I ended up putting a lot of detail into the Reliant for how freaking tiny it is in this image. I don't know, I'm proud of it. It's a small little ship. It looks pretty accurate. And then I covered it with a cloud. So, I was proud of all of my detail, and then I covered half of it with a cloud. But I guess so is art, you know? I think it ended up looking pretty good. I think it could have been a little bit darker for where it sits in the image, especially in contrast or comparison with the Enterprise, because I did make the Enterprise so much darker that maybe making the Reliant a little bit darker would have helped it have a better placement, like sense of weight in the image. There's also definitely more detail I could have put into the Enterprise. I just kind of decided not to because I was like, it's in a nebula and it's dark and you can't see it. So therefore, I'm not going to worry about it. That was my thought process. The most annoying part of the Enterprise was these long lines down the struts that connect the nacelles to the body. There's these black lines, and I was trying to make them as straight and as proportional and dimensional as I could. But you see how slow it is in even the sped up version? That tells you how slow it actually was in real life. It genuinely was a little bit of a nightmare of a process trying to get those straight and lined up and pretty. The one detail I'm quite proud of myself for including, because I also think helped sell it just that little bit much more, is the front tips of the nacelles actually have like a glow light on them. And actually several parts of the Enterprise have this pink glow on them from the nebula, and I tried to include it, and I think it helped just bring it together and bring a little bit more color to the Enterprise instead of just having it be this entity of gray. That's not very interesting to look at. So my entire goal with the Enterprise and the detail that I added was to not make it look like a giant sea of gray, even though that's kind of what it is in the image. That doesn't make for a very interesting painting, so I was trying to avoid that. I'm gonna say I'm proud of the way this final image ended up turning out, whether people say it's missing detail or not. Yes, I'm aware that the small black dot that I added on the hull of the Enterprise is not perfectly centered with the body and the bridge dome, but we're gonna ignore that. So also, here's the part where I don't know why I spent so much time on it. I wanted to add some stars. There's a limited amount of stars in the original image, but I think just some sparkly stars or some stars in general really help add to something. And I'm realizing now the reason they don't show up more is because I only used my silver and my white pearlescent paint. I never actually used white paint for the stars, and I splattered those on the canvas, and then I went in with a blue pearlescent that I have and tried to accent some parts of the nebula. I probably should have gone back in and done this again at the end, because I ended up adding so much more detail to the nebula that I think I covered up all of the blue pearlescent bits that I added. But this is the point where I actually start adding the depth to the nebula that I really think brings it all together. And it's really about recognizing those color barriers between two different tones, between the pink and the blue, of how do I either establish a change of depth or how do I establish a better blend? And those are the two questions that I was asking myself constantly during this final, nebula tweaking phase, is how do I establish depth or how do I make it a better blend? Because those two things helped solidify the final image and appearance of this nebula. And so I had all my swaths of color and where the color needed to be placed, but I really at this point had not committed to the swirls of the nebula, which is absolutely what it was missing. And you can see me starting to add those there, bringing in that darker blue and actually mixing it with a purple to make more of an indigo, and bringing those swirls in and allowing spaces for lighter blues and highlights to really emphasize the differences in levels of the nebula. And in my opinion, that was the final touch. As soon as I started bringing that in, everything started coming together, and I was so much happier with it. Because I'm going to be honest, I really wasn't convinced on day one. I was like, this just looks like color vomited onto a canvas. Like, this doesn't have any flow or structure or dimension. But once I really started committing to the darkness of some of these shapes and adding the depth, it just started coming together, and it was absolutely worth it. I finally realized what was missing, at least from some of the blue segments, and I didn't really have a good saturation on the blue, and so I was taking my more teal blue and adding my darker blue to it, and the mix of those together with a little bit of water ended up being the perfect color blend to go over most of the areas that just felt too open. So the last part of this painting is clouds that kind of help define those layers of the ships. And so I did these kind of one at a time. So the first one is around Reliant. You can kind of see it in the image, it's a little hard. And this is actually a technique I've used every time I've painted space. And it's pretty much a white dry brush, and you kind of pat it and try to smooth it and blend it over the areas you want the most intense color of whatever nebula or cloud you are going to be painting. That's where you focus it, is over those white areas. But that doesn't mean that's the only location you put it. Once the white is dry, you not only paint on top of it, but you want to go around, above, below, on top, and kind of fill gaps between it, because clouds are not a consistent density. And the only way to achieve this is by having those areas of the super bright color fading to areas of not as bright color, which is where you put the color on top of the image where it didn't have the white base. And so that's how you can kind of get a better 3D effect. And for an even better 3D effect, once that first layer of color is dry, you go back on top of it with another layer of color, and you can get even more variation and gradation in how you get, the intensity or opacity of the clouds. It's the best technique I found to paint the wispy elements of space, especially when it comes to the tendrils flaring out over the darkness of the abyss. But for this one, it's really only needed over the ships. But in general, this is a technique that I use for almost every time I paint space, because I think it works super well and helps define clouds in a more realistic and interesting way.
We're done. I'm happy with it. If you cannot tell, it is a different day. It took me 2.5 hours yesterday, and then about another hour and some change today. So it's been quite a bit of a process, but here is the finished painting. Domino's over asleep on my couch, but I'm kind of obsessed with it. I think I really got a good sense of depth. I, of course, took some artistic liberty when it comes to, in the picture that I'll probably put on screen or over my face, there is some shadowing over the Enterprise, and it's kind of like this large, monotonous thing. But since I was including so much of the saucer section in the image, I wanted to be able to break it up, and I probably talked about this in the voiceover, but make it a little bit more interesting. I think I absolutely got a sense of depth. I think towards the last couple rounds of painting I did on the outside, really settling in those dimensions of those rings, helped get some light and, you know, some depth to this image. I mean, I'm happy. I love this. I have no idea where I'm gonna hang it up in my apartment, but I will find it a home, because if this is not on my wall, this is a shame. And look! You can't tell that there was something on the canvas before I started. This is a lesson of, if you ever put something, like draw something on a canvas, you should probably either paint it right away, you know, or I don't know what the lesson there is, but that was my fault. I did a sort of okay job getting the sides. I kind of just tried to get it with a color and then ignored it as I started adding like layers of colors and dimensions, so it's not... It's definitely not perfect, but I couldn't really care less. I mean, especially from a distance, I think it reads incredibly well. I'm so happy with it. There's a few things I would change for some reason. All of the like splatter stars that I was doing kept wanting to go around the Reliant, which is this little guy, if you don't know this scene from the movie. Not sure why that was happening, kind of annoying, because the Reliant also has these like white dots. I realized there's also, I straight up didn't paint that because it's supposed to be a super bright thing. So that's just not painted. I don't think it matters. There are some other white dots, like there's a trio of dots up here that I didn't put. Artistic liberty. So it's a nebula, it's multicolored, there's ships in it. I think I hit all the dots. I'm really happy with this. This is definitely the longest creation process that I've done so far, because my makeups typically take me about 2 hours. I guess Cthulhu took a while. I don't remember how long that sculpture took. But I'm super happy with this. This is a very different kind of space, because if you look at the image, there's not black. Like, this is the most black that it gets. Typically, space, like for this one, there's a lot of black and there's things to build up and like go off of. But this image has no black. So it's a very different interpretation of space. And I can't say I'm mad at that. I love painting space like this. And this was a different kind of fun challenge. I have a bunch of reference pictures. I need to clean my table. Food for thought. Put down something if you're gonna do splatter. We'll see if it comes off. If not, now there's sparkles in all of my videos. Great planning. But I have a lot of ideas for space like this as well. Space is genuinely one of my favorite things to paint because it's fun and there's so many different things out there. And yes, I know this is not what it visually looks like, you know, infrared sensors and all of that, but it's pretty, so I don't care. I'm gonna put this back. Okay. But with all of that said, if you are still here, thank you so much for sticking around. If you somehow stumbled across this video and this was your first video of mine, hi, welcome. Otherwise, if you are not new, thanks for tuning into another one. I really enjoyed this. This was super fun. again, really spur the moment idea because I saw the movie. I hope I don't look like trash because I have not put makeup on for this outro, so let me wrap it up because I just realized that. But if you like this video, give it a like, subscribe if you want. I do a lot of artistic content. I plan to do a lot of painting in the future because it's fun. Comment if there's a nebula. If you want to comment your favorite nebula. Space, nebula from like Hubble or James Webb. And maybe I'll paint it in one of my later painting videos. Other than that, thank you for tuning in. And I will see you in the next one. Bye.